I'm so glad to have Garrett here today from Petaluma team. He was part of our last Leap Venture Studio cohort, and I asked him to join us today because he gave this presentation to our fellow cohort founders. And I think the way that they're writing environmental sustainability and impact into the mission of Petaluma is a really amazing cause and just super well done with their startup from the beginning. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Garrett.
Thanks so much, Isabel, and thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. My name is Garrett Wymore. I'm a co-founder of Petaluma. We're a sustainable pet nutrition company. We're launching our first baked dog food actually next week. And as Isabel mentioned, I was participated in the Leap Venture Studios Accelerator. I was actually previously at Mars Pet Care as part of Whistle, which is a GPS tracking device and activity monitor. And I think when we were first starting Petaluma, 2 years ago, we really saw sustainability as a kind of core value proposition, and something because it was something that consumers wanted in pet food and in pet care more broadly. But for whatever reason, it hadn't really become a talking point yet to the same extent it had in other. It's interesting to see that you've got like Microsoft and Amazon and big tech companies or B2B companies talking about them being carbon neutral or the steps they're taking towards the environment, and a much more kind of tangible and a space. I would have assumed that pet industry had started talking about sustainability at an earlier stage because I think it's closely tied to our a lot of the missions of companies in the space. So all that said, we wanted to both build it into our products and also into kind of the DNA of the company. And I think it's a really great time to start, or it's really a great time to start more sustainable companies because there's so many resources out there. And I'll start walking through some of the materials we pulled together. But there's a ton of organizations that provide both the resources, a framework, and kind of the ability to have a direct impact that I think would have been really difficult, trying to navigate the space yourself, even a couple of years ago before some of these organizations existed. Let me share my screen. And please feel free to jump in at any point with questions. Oh, sorry. See, are you guys getting the entire screen or just a portion of it?
No, we've got the whole thing. There's just, I think, a browser app. Oh, no, they have it.
Sorry. Can you see? Okay, cool. You can see the whole screen. Great. Awesome. So I think just a couple points on why we went down this path. Some of these may seem obvious, but I think from both a customer and employee side, people want to, particularly if you're a newer company, you need to have a strategy about kind of how and a reason to be beyond your products. I think people are looking for companies that have more so than just a broader hey, this product works well mission. It's this product works well and it does good mission is really important from a customer standpoint, and also in recruiting the best talent into the company. We also think about it, I think a huge one is kind of as a competitive edge. When you think about kind of the David versus Goliath scenario, we're in the pet food space. It's got a ton of giant players that are we're nipping at the heels of. And being a small kind of nimble company that's establishing its business practice for the first times allows you to make bolder decisions. It'd be really difficult for someone like Mars or Nestle to take on some of these major certifications, because it would be both expensive to change all of your existing product lines. You maybe haven't had customers who value you for those things, so you're making that decision and maybe not having customers put as much value onto those decisions as when you're building the company from scratch. So I think we'll go through some of the costs associated with this, but the costs actually are not that bad when you're small, right? Like they're not onerous as they would be when you're trying to like reinvent your supply chain or double back and meet up with a really heavily established business model. And I also just think it's the right thing to do. It's the right conversation to be having. there's a lot of pressure, I think, even on traditional business structures in particularly in the United States, but around the world. And what is the role of kind of the way that we've structured capital tables and profit margins and structures that have led to a ton of wealth accumulation, and often at the expense of environmental destruction, and that new companies have an opportunity to kind of restructure themselves to address those issues from day one versus waiting until they become, whether they're going to address some of the negative externalities that they're creating. Big question that we got was that.
Sorry, your audio is breaking up just a tiny bit.
Oh, sorry.
Different Wi-Fi, maybe.
Let me see. Maybe one. Okay. Can you hear me better?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Great. One of the big questions we get is can you afford to do this? When you're kind of scraping by, bootstrapping dollars, and is this a good way to spend limited investment capital? I think it is, as long as you're marketing it as a core value proposition. So I think that a lot of companies, this is not something to just kind of check the box, not talk about at all. This to get a good return on this, and you have to survive as a business to be sustainable. I think you need to be financially sustainable as well as environmentally and socially, and really making it a core part of how you talk about the product. And there's a ton of good examples of brands that have done that now. We talked about Allbirds now prints their carbon footprint on the shoe, and then shows that they're and then they go and offset it to zero. You see companies that are now being accepted as B Corps, putting that right on the front display of the store. When you walk down some of the main shopping districts in San Francisco, you see big posters for B Corp in the doors. So I think there's clearly getting a consumer reaction there, but you really need to market it. I think another way to kind of make sure you're not to reduce the amount of time that this takes is just lean into some of these certifying organizations. I was shocked by the kind of breadth and quality of materials that a lot of these companies or a lot of these organizations provided. We'll go through the B Corp impact assessment, but that was a really important doc for us and something that we refer back to frequently as we're bringing on team members and trying to figure out our own hiring employee practices, because they've done a ton of thinking about around that. And you can, you basically apply some of the existing toolkits and have a huge head start. And I think, another one is just people are worried about investor responses. When B Corps first came out, there was this huge confusion in the space around nonprofit. Like, oh, are you a nonprofit now? If you're either a completely for-profit organization or you're a nonprofit, and there's nothing in between. I think we've seen that, a very small number of investors who are worried or won't invest into a public benefit corporation, and that there are a lot who are maybe preferentially investing into that sector. So I think a lot of the initial concerns that this was going to be a problem on the investment side was hasn't really played out. Any questions there before we jump into some of the actual organization bodies? So these are really, sorry for being so dense with information on these slides. I can share them afterwards as well. But just to give a kind of a lay of the land of some of the ones. These are the organizations that we ended up deciding to go with. So just for some disclosure there, we went ahead and are going through the B Corp certification process. We're right now a pending B Corp, which is kind of a intermediate step for startups. It turns out it's pretty hard to have good answers to a lot of the questions about employment practices and community engagement when you are have no paid employees and it's just founders. So that we needed a little of extra time there. But I think B Corp is probably the broadest when it comes to defining sustainability. It actually goes a little bit beyond that. And their tagline is that they want businesses that balance purpose and profit. And I think that really resonated with us, and this broader idea that you're not only making a product that works well and serves customers' needs, your company needs to be committed to something broader and doing good. The big, one of the innovations in this space was actually just the real government structure, so that they actually created these structures. For example, Delaware has a public benefit corporation, and a lot of states now do. We actually incorporated as a public benefit corporation, which means part of our charter that we're chartered to consider a public good in the same way that we consider our financial stakeholders and shareholders, so that we're committed and actually contractually obligated to consider the public good that we're focused on, and that every company can define whatever public good it is that they're or public benefit that they're working towards. B Corp is now global. I think it has the most consumer recognition. So B Corp, this is something that is increasingly on products and services that people use, and they're now recognizing it. And there's a lot more awareness around what it is and what it means. It's broader. It's talking about issues like diversity and inclusivity, career development, civic engagement. How are you treating your employees? What opportunities are you giving them? How much ownership of the company do they have? How are you engaging with your community? How big of a pay gap is there between your highest paid and lowest paid employees? So this is really a holistic view of the business, in addition to some of the environmental pieces that I think some of these other organizations are maybe a little bit more focused on. Right now. So the biggest portion of this is going through a impact assessment. So once you've maybe consider doing it, you can actually sign on, I believe, still, even as a non-committed company, and fill out that assessment and see how you would do before actually going through with it. Then again, it does take like 10, we found it took 10 to 20 hours to complete. It's really comprehensive questions. And they only accept companies that score over 80 points on that. So there's 200 possible points, and you have to score above 80 to be certified. And the cost of it is about basically $1,000 per year, plus what it works out to be about 0.01% of your revenue. So just a way for them to scale up certification cost with size slightly. The challenges I mentioned here, I think one challenge right now is that they're extremely backlogged, I believe. I think there's a lot of companies trying to do this now, and that they're trying to catch up. So if you did want to start doing this, it would take maybe 9 months to get through the process. That's at least what we're hearing from other founders in the space. There's a big documentation overhead, and oftentimes it's just hard to answer questions and score above an 80 when you don't have a team hired yet. But if you're within your first year of incorporation as a public benefit corp, you can get a pending B Corp status, as long as you're legally structured that way. Just for what that looks like. So this is a couple screenshots from the actual impact assessment. You'll see that there's a ton of different areas that they focus on: governance, workers, community, environment, your customers, and some other things that are kind of like red flags, like make sure you're not supporting or you don't have other issues with the business. But they're really going to go deep into the questions there. You can see that there's probably 200 questions in this, or 150 plus very tactical questions about what is your company actually doing to derive points and value from these things. Another organization that we're a participant with is 1% for the Planet. So this one's definitely just a broad framework that basically says member organizations are to commit to donating 1% of revenue of net sales to member nonprofits. And I think there's more than 3,000 approved nonprofits that are part of the organization. They're adding new ones every day. We just had a local organization that we thought would be a good fit, that we were able to suggest that they add, and was evaluated and added. So I think that's something that they're looking to expand, and you have some flexibility there if you participate. The general idea here is that there's businesses and people benefit from the environment, and oftentimes businesses and people also pollute it with their actions, and that I think even if you're a environmentally focused company and you're trying to make better decisions about your product, it becomes even more clear that there's a ton of externalities associated with your decisions, and you can't reduce all of your carbon emissions. You can't stop the use of single-use plastics. There's a lot of things that are kind of built into the system that are unsolvable at the moment. And we found 1% for the planet is a good way of addressing that, and at a minimum, giving back and funding some of these good causes that maybe don't fit directly into your business model that you're passionate about. So it's relatively easy to understand. I think from a consumer standpoint, it's just you're giving 1% of your purchase, and that's how we message it. Is everything that you buy, 1% of that is going to, in our case, groups fighting climate change and food insecurity. And it's relatively simple from a certification standpoint. You're just committing to donating 1% of gross sales to one of those organizations. One nice piece, it does allow up to 50% of the donation value to be in volunteer time. Promotional support basically means promoting, if you're going to have we'll be running a lot of digital ads. We can mention some of the nonprofits that we're working with, as long as you do it in kind of an approved way, and drive some of that awareness to them as well. And that counts towards some of the commitment. The membership cost is relatively small of the total, and it was quick. The whole thing for us, I think it was less than 2 hours. It's just a matter of making sure it actually fits into your company business model. Obviously, 1% of net sales can be a pretty onerous number. So I think that the big challenge here is just, can you afford to do it? I think with we're a more premium priced and positioned product, and one that, if we're going to be talking about environmental sustainability over and over again, I think it's critical. It was critical for us to do it and kind of bite the bullet. And honestly, I'm sure we have more than 1% of our sales in kind of negative environmental externalities anyway. So this is our way of addressing those. Sorry, was there any other questions on 1% for the planet?
Yeah, I have a question, Garrett. This is Catherine.
Hey there.
For the 1% for the planet, do you have to be a specific type of company? Like, do you have to be a corporation to participate in that?
You know what? No, that one's the broadest. They even have individual members, or people who are members of 1% for the planet, who say, I'm going to donate 1% of my total salary or 1% of my income to these causes. So I think they're the most broad. They're looking for. I would have to look through their rules, but it seemed like they will accept a wide variety of people and structures.
Okay, great, thank you.
Climate Neutral is another organization we're part of. So I think Climate Neutral, there's been a lot of talk around carbon offsets, kind of what people are, I think climate change is probably the most pressing from from an actual environmental standpoint, plus consumer response to it, right? Like I think there's an increasing group that believe that this is a urgent crisis that needs to be addressed now by both companies and people. And I think Climate Neutral is a relatively new organization that's been built to try to have companies take more personal action in the absence of probably major government action here. And so this is a standard that a company can earn basically by both offsetting and then reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. So part of it is purchasing offsets, part of it is developing a plan to minimize your greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the big goals here was to have a label that consumers can recognize, that's standardized across companies, that that the offsets purchased were evaluated. So one of the big problems in the offset industry or carbon offset industry is where's the money actually going towards? What are the project? Is it actually doing what it says it's going to? And then also having kind of some standardization around knowing that the company actually followed through with it. And you've seen Climate Neutral really explode in membership in the last couple of years as more companies join on to this kind of joint initiative. The process here for us, you go through, you do a calculation of what you'd estimate your greenhouse gas emissions to be. It's a great tool. I know they've co-developed it with some people in the academics space who have, for us, it was, we did our own full life cycle assessment of our product, and I wish we would have had, a Climate Neutral's tool earlier, because it would help put some values against some of these maybe harder to measure things, and package it without asking you, to really have to audit your entire business. So you fill that out. If it's your less than $5 million a year in annual operating cost, it's really simplified. So for us, it was not it's not as big of a process as going through every single facility or partner you work with. One one thing, I think the big thing for us is I was surprised that it was as cheap as it was. The price of carbon offsets, I think, were less than I had thought they were. They're obviously onerous at a systemic level, because otherwise we would probably have more, it'd be easier to fund these things. But it worked out to be about a $400 fee to join, and then like $6 to $8 per ton of greenhouse gas emissions. That will work out for us to be between like 1/4 and 0.4% of operating costs a year, in terms of amount of emissions, or the amount of offsets that we'll need to purchase as a pet food manufacturer or distributor. And there's going to be some industries that are more greenhouse gas intensive than others that would likely need to pay more. But that's how it worked. We worked out into that I think 0.3% of our operating cost space. And time-wise, I think that it was easy to get started and actually do the assessment. The harder one is putting together a reduction plan. So after you've done this, you need to put together how are you going to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions going forward. One thing to note here is that Climate Neutral is a approved member organization of 1% for the Planet. So this actually applies to your 1% for the Planet commitment. So you've started to meet that commitment by buying carbon offsets for your business, which is nice. It allows you to have I think obviously reducing greenhouse gas emissions is an important part of companies' environmental commitment, and it allows you to not kind of double dip on having to spend a ton across both of those. So I think this one can be expensive, and it also has a more formal certification structure. So I think they are open for enrollment in April and close in June, and then you have to wait till the following year to go through that process. So this would be, if you were interested in this, it'd be doing it next year. Some other companies that we looked at and that we thought were interesting. Some of these are the first two are more focused on plastic waste, which I think is really interesting. It's something that a lot of companies are trying to solve in the absence of, in our case, you can't have giant pet food giant bags of dog food that are currently recyclable in the United States. So you are creating a lot of single-use plastics. And TerraCycle offers some of these recycling programs where you can actually return it to them, return the packaging to TerraCycle to be recycled in facilities, that could not be curbside recycled. I'm not sure where they're at now. When we talked to them, it was prohibitively expensive. It was really only available to really large businesses doing a lot of volume, because the program started at $50,000 plus. Plastic Neutral is another organization that's I think more focused on smaller companies as well. That actually allows you to put a label called Certified Plastic Neutral, because they're funding offsets through recycling programs around the world. And that one, I believe, was like around 25 cents per pound of plastic that you generate is what it costs to fund programs to recycle it, pull it out of the ocean, or in different types of those programs. Fair trade, fair trade is focused mostly on farm worker treatment for agricultural products, and mostly at a global level. So if you've got a more global supply chain, for us, most of our products are coming from the United States and Canada. And fair trade is primarily focused on ingredients that you need to source from, what they would call developing countries. There's no US or UK, I don't think, fair trade certified products, which is interesting because I think they're, one of the things we're focused on and concerned about is just the lack of, the United States and Canada and, other, and other countries also have issues with, with standards put in place to protect farm workers. And there's not really standards. There's no organization that we found out there yet that provides buyers of agricultural ingredients with more assurances that farm workers were compensated fairly for their work, et cetera. So that's a challenge that if anyone else has ideas around or has worked with organizations, we're always looking with. Pet Sustainability Coalition is another group that I think started the last couple of years. Specifically focused on sustainability and pet care. They've adopted many of the B Corp and United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in their own kind of toolkits, which is great. We're working directly as a B Corp, so we found a lot of the toolkits were similar. But I know that they're coming out with their own. They just came out with their own certification. We haven't looked a ton into it, so I'm not as familiar with that as I probably should be. But I believe it has it borrows a lot from B Corps. Okay, well, that's the materials I have. I'm happy to chat through any questions if there are any.
Feel free
I
to
have a
chime in.
question.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Catherine.
I have a couple questions for you, Garrett. The first one is, I noticed on your website, you make a lot of statements about how your food compares to like a traditional meat-based food. And you can download the report that you guys had somebody help you with. Can you just talk a little bit about like that process? And it sounds like you did that before you did any of these certifications.
Yeah, so we did, I think we wanted to do a life cycle assessment, which isn't actually part. I think the carbon climate neutral one has some does a simplified version that's basically just, oh, you're a pet food manufacturer, so your number is X. We're doing it differently. They're assuming that companies are using meat. They're assuming, which is one of the biggest drivers there. So for us, we couldn't just take like a top level estimate. And we thought it was important to articulate, a core value proposition of our product is the lower resource intensiveness, particularly of the ingredients. So for us, we really go ingredient by ingredient and say, where does this ingredient come from? How much fresh water does it take to grow this ingredient? What is the greenhouse gas emissions associated with it? What's the land use impact? And so I worked with a consultant who's done this for a number of larger companies, but that was a much more, I think, intensive process for us to go through all of our own ingredients. And then one of the trickier parts there was finding a industry benchmark. So we had used some of the existing industry data that was publicly available from something like the Pet Food Institute commissioned it, I believe. So that one was really doing like a deep dive of what are all the ingredients going into pet food, how much of them are in there, and then what's the factor associated with each one of those, and was much more of a kind of a choice for us to do that to make better decisions about what goes in the food. So I was surprised about how much for example, rice is extremely water intensive, and especially with drought in California this year, it's become something that you think more about. And that making decisions about what goes in the food and what doesn't is really helpful if you can actually put up those resource intensive numbers next to your, as you're formulating the product. But it wasn't part of any of the formal certifications. I think there's still a little bit of like art and science that goes into life cycle assessments, because unless you're able to spend a ton of money and actually measure all the inputs and outputs of the plant and then go into individual suppliers and audit their facilities, which in pet food is almost impossible because these supply chains are so long and commoditized. But yeah, sorry, that's a meandering long answer to that question. But
okay, yeah, no, that's great. I mean, that's something that I want to do for Bright Planet. How long did that take to complete?
I think it took us 40 plus hours of work on that. I'm happy to share some materials there that I have of like, here's the what we're using for the existing industry data and some of the data.
Okay.
I think I've linked out to them and I have the life cycle assessment on our website. It sounds like
Yep.
but I'm happy to send over some materials there that we
Oh,
have.
that would be really helpful. Thank you. Okay, I have one more question too about packaging. Can you talk a little bit about like the type of packaging you guys are using, because that's been a challenge for us. And if you're not using any sort of like more sustainable packaging right now, what are your plans for the future?
Yeah, so I think that it's something, we're now, we're looking at our kind of next dog food formula and a treat formula. And so it's something I talked to the packaging suppliers all the time about what's available. It seems like there's been some advancements on the compostable and recyclable side. So I believe there's now fully curbside compostable and fully curbside recyclable for smaller packages. That's like, under 5 pounds. So mostly treat bag sizes, you can do fully compostable or recyclable. Larger than that, I believe there's a company called Grounded that is now offering a fully curbside recyclable larger bag. they're one of the first I've heard to do it. I know there's some in Europe that are considered recyclable that maybe are not recyclable in the US. But yeah, it's been tricky. Well, one thing, so this is a company, they're actually based in Petaluma, they're called Books, but they make these reusable boxes that then fold up nicely and you send them back. The consumer can slap a label on them and send them back to the company. And they can, so, we're a D2C company. So we have a lot of boxes going out, but you see there's a label on the bottom there. And so when the consumer uses it, it folds into this small piece, and they're honestly similar price to normal corrugated boxes. Or they're not prohibitively more expensive. And so that it's a nice way of, especially for big dog food boxes that I know I feel guilty about, and you get 30 pounds of dog food with a giant box. Corrugated or cardboard is really easily like one of the most recycled goods. So, those boxes are being recycled, but this is a good way to just reuse it over and over again, which we like as well.
Cool, thanks.
It's called Books.
Does anyone else have any questions for Garrett? Feel free to type it in the chat box or chime in. If not, I know, Catherine is working on a product that I think aligns really similar to Petaluma and innovating in sustainability. But for the other people on the call that maybe aren't working on a food product or something has an obvious tie to environmental sustainability, what are 2 to 3 things that, these founders can do tomorrow to really prioritize environmental sustainability regardless of their product or service? So, maybe if they don't have the $400 to $500 available for some of these certifications, what are some smaller things that they can do, even if they're a solo founder and just getting started?
Yeah, totally. I think one of the big things is just knowing what parts of your business maybe do have the biggest impact. Because I think it's really easy to focus on things that are like top of mind. For example, packaging in the industry gets more focused than it should because people touch it, and then the consumer has to make the decision. The consumer feels like they're the one who's like polluting because they're the ones throwing it out, and so packaging gets all this chatter when the actual things, a lot of times the raw materials and ingredients going into it are the the much bigger issue. So I think if you're in a services business, or if you're in it's figuring out what are the parts of your business that probably are having maybe some negative impacts. And one of the things you can do, I think Climate Neutral's tool is actually publicly available. So you can go in there and enter some parts about you, and they actually show you what are your tier 1 contributions versus tier 2 versus tier 3, which is which ones are direct from you, which ones come from your supplier. And that's just based on what industry you're in. So I think for us, it was really helpful as we were just formulating the product before we were, going to commit to any of these things, just what portion of the total is coming from transportation, right? We're a D2C company, makes me nervous to be, sending, packages through the mail. And I think we found that it was a really small portion of the total, right? The ingredients were bigger, and that's where we spent more of our time focused up front. And just knowing that maybe allows you to make, to kind of sense check things in your head of where should I spend, if I am going to spend more money or spend more time thinking about it, make sure it's on the issues that are actually, relevant to your business. And those tools are, I think, all free, right? There's a ton of things all online that were 100% free. So.
That's great. That's awesome. Thank you. Awesome. Yeah, and then Hope mentioned some other types of sustainable packaging, which is great. If we don't have any other questions right now, I think this was a ton of information and super useful. So thank you so much, Garrett. And I'll be uploading this to YouTube if you want to look back at any of those slides and get some more information. But really, really grateful for your time. And thank you everyone else for joining. I think most of you are part of our Slack channel already, but if you have any questions there, or you want to get more engaged and keep continuing to discuss this topic, definitely do so in the Slack channel. But with that, I hope everyone has a great day, and thank you so much.
No, this is
Thank you, Garrett. Thanks, Isabel.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Garrett.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.